Some of you in this room right now, maybe you have some friends, colleagues, children who are in pain. I don't mean physical pain, just pain in general. Their life is not as meaningful as they like. Maybe they're really successful based upon the current definition of success, but for one reason or another, they're not happy. Some of you might be thinking about quitting school because you're unhappy. Some of you might be thinking about quitting work. Some of you perhaps quitting your marriages, and hopefully none of us quitting life. So it's with this context that I want to talk about this definition of success, because I think our definition of success is part of the problem. First and foremost, I want to start with talking about each and every one of you. 7.7 billion people walking this planet, and each of us are unique. Some tall, some short, some thin, some not so thin. Some extremely bright mathematicians, other literary geniuses, some of us aspiring artists, some of us empathetic physicians, some of us beautiful and giving teachers. But despite our uniqueness, we all have common circuitry. And what do I mean by common circuitry? We have common physiological circuitry built into us that gives us the ability to engage this world. We have people and wonderful academics and researchers such as Noam Chomsky and Richard Dawkins. We have Jonathan Haidt and many, many others. Each of these individuals telling us or showing us that we have something common about us. Common moral systems, common ability to engage language, common DNA, common genes, all of them important to engage this world. But I want to talk about something that's even before their research, which is a simple idea, and I think we all know what it is. It's this idea of our response to fight or flight. Many of you have probably heard about it. Many of us, think about to the first human that walked the planet, we've recognized that we're in situations of fear all the time. And when you're in a situation of fear, you could do one of two things. The response is simply stay and fight, or the response is leave and run. But it's with that response that I think created in us and in our world today, perhaps not the best definition of success, and let me explain. Every time we identify with fear, we can leave or we can fight, or we can build something to make sure that that doesn't happen ever again. Think through or think about history. What have we done? We've recognized that we had political systems that weren't necessarily the best under a monarchy. What did we realize? We recognized we had some fear there. We had some problems there. So what did we do? We created, or we allowed a theocracy, and then we realized that that wasn't necessarily the best thing, and then we created a republic, and then from a republic, a democracy. You see, each and every time we invented new things, we used reason, logic, and rationality. And it's this idea that most of us would probably agree is a wonderful thing to have, but maybe it can go too far. Give you an example of the gated community. Many of us, historically our parents or our parents' parents, were born in a communal, in an urban environment. Well, what did we realize? We started to think amongst ourselves that maybe the urban environment has too much risk. There's too much crime. So what do? We go create gated communities. We put up big walls. We built 5,000 square foot houses with security systems and security guards. Think about this one for a second. Let this one land on us. We've created fake personas on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. Why do we do that? Why do people make their lives look better on these social media platforms? Because what? They're worried about, they see a risk identified, or they identify a risk. And that risk is what? That risk is that they're not as good or as competitive or don't have a life as good as somebody else. So we make up these fake lives. We have become obsessed with risk. We create risks even when they're not there. Now, that's not my idea. That's been talked about for thousands of years. To give you an example of this, 3,750 years ago, there was a book written, and I'm not here to talk about faith, but there was a book written called the Book of Genesis. And many of you probably heard the story of Adam and Eve. But you probably haven't heard it this way. There was a first man, presumed first man, and the presumed first woman. And God was in control. And God said to these two individuals, you can have everything you want here in this garden. Everything and anything. Only rule is you can't touch from that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or you'll die. So they understand this, and a few days go by, and the story has it that a serpent comes up to the woman and says, surely God didn't say you can't touch from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The woman responds, not only did he say that, but he also said if we touch the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we will surely die. Now, I want that to land for a second because that is what I'm talking about. Eve in that story created risk a risk that did not exist. We made it up 3,750 years ago when that book was presumed to be written. We've been talking about this ever since. We create risks. We create risks that aren't there. And the problem, there's real problems with this, which I'll get into. Every time we identify a risk, I call it risk identification to a process of risk mitigation, we put up a wall, we put up a barrier. And every time we put up a wall or we put up a barrier, we are alienating ourselves from other people. We alienate ourselves from communities. We alienate ourselves from our wives and our husbands. We alienate ourselves from our children, and the list goes on. This is what Dr. Putnam referred to in his book, Bowling Alone. What we have done is we've created a society where there's no engagement. We might say we have friends, and we might say we have colleagues, and we might say we have husbands and wives and children. But the reality is we're not really engaging we're only engaging at a surface level. Putnam talks in his book about bonding capital and bridging capital. I'm not going to spend time on it, but it's simply this. I can't bond with other people unless I get to know them and experience risk with them and really understand their problems and they understand mine. I can't bridge between whites and blacks, Hispanics, without bridging capital. You see, the problem is most of us aren't engaging, aren't doing what we really need to do in order to live a better life because we put up these risk barriers and these barriers that aren't necessarily needed or required. I'm going to take you through a little exercise, 5-second exercise, okay, but bear with me. Show of hands, how many of you have been told by your parents, loved ones, that if you did well in high school, you would get to a good college? How many of you heard that if you do well in college, good GPA, you'll get a good job? And how many of you heard if you get a good job, you'll make a lot of money? And if you make a lot of money, you'll get a nice house and a nice car and maybe a pretty wife, right? We've created a society of getters, right? And if you think about this, why do we need to get a lot of money? Okay, I'm going to use that word in a very derogatory sense because we need that so that we can have the house. We need that so we can create the barriers. We need that so we can mitigate all the risk. You see, what we're doing in our world right now is we're allowing the world to engage with us in this respect. And we're not engaging with the world. We're dealing with risk, but we're not dealing with the other part of it, which is what I want to get into. I'm going to try to explain most of this with a story of a friend of mine. I have a friend who was born outside the United States. He was born to two extremely competitive parents. And they built in him and his family, his siblings, the wanting to be successful through competition. So they competed in sports at a very young age. They competed in academics at a very young age. They went to the best high schools. They went to the best colleges. They went to all of the Ivy Leagues. He got his PhD from an Ivy League. He went to go work for the best corporations. He made the most amount of money of all my friends I've ever had. And then one day I see him and I said, how you doing? He says, I'm going to go start my own company. So why are you starting your own company? I'm not progressing fast enough. I said, what do you need? He says, well, I'm so worried that I don't have enough money to take care of my kids. I'm so worried that if I lose my job, I'm so worried, fill in the blank. It's continuous. Worry, worry, worry. And I said, I don't think you should be worrying about that. You have probably $5 or $6 million in the bank. What's to worry about? You don't know, Chris. You don't understand because you're not here. Here's the second question I asked him. I said, how about your friendships? How are things with your friends? Well, Chris, I'm not really sure. I don't gauge there. And the friends I have, I really think that they're here just to kind of come use my pool. Beautiful pool, okay? So I had these multiple conversations with them. A few years passed by. I said, hey, how's your wife? She left me. Why'd she leave you? I'm just not good enough at being a husband. I haven't figured that one out, but I'm still working at it. How's your kids? Kids are, they're okay. They didn't want to get into that with me. What's the point here? The point is, here is a person that in all standards, global standards, when it comes to success, probably after he sold multiple companies was worth over $100 million, but everything that really mattered to him, was gone. It didn't exist. Because why? Because he was a getter. He bought into this getting mentality. Probably the fittest person I knew, the richest person I knew. Goodness gracious, he was really a good-looking guy too, right? He had good-looking children. He had a beautiful wife. He had beautiful homes throughout the world, but everything that really mattered to him was gone. I'm not going to go through this in this whole quote, but Zygmunt Bauman wrote a book called Liquid Times, and in this book, he talks about progress. And it goes simply like this. As we become more and more of a society of progress, and I don't mean that in a political sense at all, but as we become more and more of a society of progress, what starts to occur is competition is so great and so venomous in many respects that we live in a world that's almost dystopian. We have everything, at least we think we need, but we don't really have anything we do need, right? And in this sense, like many of the students I engage with on a daily basis, many executives I engage with on a daily basis, they're paranoid. They're living a life of paranoia. And they're so paranoid because if they don't put in the 8 hours to study for the exam, their best friend will, or their quote-unquote best friend will, and they'll lose out. So we're constantly competing in every single thing we do. And when we're competing, we're living in a get society. Now, I'm not saying that competition's bad. Please don't misunderstand that. But what I'm suggesting here is that when we're in a get society, where I have to get everything, I have to constantly think about getting, and when I'm engaging with other people who are getting too, that creates friction. That creates a society where it's hard for me to develop a relationship, a real relationship. Most of the people, many of you in this room, most of my students who are unbelievably successful in the classroom, many of the executives I work with are also. They're the quintessential ant, the insect. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, there's many fables of the ants. The Bible talks about the ant. Many holy texts talk about the ant. And the ant is the most prudent of all insects. Why? Because the ant can go out, work very hard in the summer, so they have enough for the winter. They're always thinking about themselves. They're not thinking about anyone around them. They don't have rulers. They don't have leaders. It's all about me, 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 me. And I'm trying to make the argument here that the ant is what we think the life of success is in modern society. But see, the ant is totally different than the bee. Now, I'm not sure why the holy texts and various fables don't talk enough about the bee, but Aesop, if you're familiar with him, he's a 5th century moralist and writer. He talks about the bee. And that's what I want to explain over the next few minutes. What does the bee do that's different than the ant? Well, think about this for a second. In order for the bee to survive, the bee first goes to the flower. And the bee goes to the flower and it pollinates the flower. After it pollinates the flower, it takes its nectar and it goes back to its hive and it shares its nectar with everybody in the hive, all other bees. So they first give in order to get. But it's much more than that. right? So the ant just gets for themselves. The bee gives first, gets second. But what I think is even more magical than that, what creates real wonder in the world for everybody, the beauty of the world, is the ants not only focused on the flower, the bee is not only focused on the flower, and the bee is not only focused on its hive, but the bee is focused on everyone in society. Everybody in the world benefits from the actions of the bee. I'm suggesting here for all of us today, those of you that are living a life without meaning, that meaning doesn't start by getting. Most of us, if we look back on our lives right now and just took a quick picture of all the times you felt the most joy, the most meaning in your life, it wasn't when you were getting. It was when you were giving. Or maybe not even giving, but you felt good about somebody else. You felt wonderful about somebody else's progress. So many of you, when you see a great audition or you see somebody who, was a failure in the past, based upon modern standards, achieve success, many of us perhaps weep, but most of us feel real joy inside of us. You feel unbelievable joy that you don't understand why. And it's because not only does that primordial nature of fight and flight matter, but our ability to love matters even more. See, we don't get success. We don't get meaning by asking for stuff and taking stuff. We obtain meaning and achieve meaning by giving first, like the bee. If you want to live a life of meaning, you have to first start with giving. Relationships begin with giving. Family structures that actually matter begin with giving. If you want to create a wonderful corporation, and I teach in the business school here, it doesn't start with how much cash flow can I get. It doesn't start with how much can I extrapolate or get from the world. It starts with where can I find the biggest problem that my uniqueness, my individual uniqueness, can be used the best. So when I talk about giving here, I don't mean in a charitable sense. I mean in a sense where it can continually happen, right? So if you want to live a life of meaning, you first have to obtain and understand where your unique skill is, and then use that skill to benefit the world. I'm going to leave you with this. I dare you, especially for those of you who are struggling or friends who are struggling, I dare you to do this. Leave this room today. Think about where that uniqueness is inside of you. Share that with just one person. I don't care if it's the garbage man. I don't care if it's the lady at the supermarket. Share your uniqueness somehow. I dare you to just love a little bit more and be the bee. You'll find real meaning in your life. Thank you.